기자부대! Hamon the beat!
For about the past year, anyone who has been a member on my Patreon page has had the benefit of submitting questions for me to answer at the end of videos. I like doing these since it lets me cover a lot of topics I haven't been able to go over elsewhere, but since all the answers are so spread out, I thought I might compile them in a more easy-to-find place. So this video will just be a compilation of my patron questions so far. For the patron question of this video, SpongeCake asks, Hey Hamon Beat, my question is, what is your ranking for each part in terms of favorite to least favorite? Well, personally, I think I don't have a very objective ranking of JoJo parts. I mostly consider them all equal, but some can move up or down depending on how I feel. But the one thing I do firmly believe is that Araki has gotten better with time, so I would group them like this. 1, 2, and 3 are in one tier, then I believe 4, 5, and 6 are in a tier above that, then 7 and 8 are even better than those. However, I would say that while it is close, Part 7 edges out to being my favorite of the bunch. This video's patron question comes from 17-Hit Combo. He asks, what are my favorite arcs from each part? This is a question I've previously thought about a lot, so it won't be hard for me to answer. In Part 1, the section that spans from the time skip up until Dio's first defeat at the mansion is my favorite. I enjoyed how it maintained the gothic feel of early Phantom Blood before the series added other powers like Hamon. For Part 2, the chariot race against Wamuu is my favorite section. I think it's the emotional peak of the part taking place immediately after Caesar's death, and it's the best showcase of Joseph's tactics in this story. For Part 3, of course, the final segment is the best. This was my single most anticipated moment for the anime adaptation, and everything about it leading up to the ending managed to drive me to tears. For Part 4, I can narrow down my favorite fight to Josuke's battle with Highway Star. It's an exhilarating chase, and that motion is somehow perfectly translated into a still image on the page. It also includes some of my favorite uses of Josuke's abilities. In Part 5, my favorite is the battle on the train with Prosciutto and Pesci. They're the most charismatic and likable of the minor villains in my opinion, and the way that Bucciarati contributed to that fight cements him as one of my favorite characters. In Part 6, I'd have to say it's Heavy Weather. The sheer amount of insanity that's introduced in the arc, combined with the drama from Pucci and Weather's backstory, makes for an incredible ride. For Part 7, I'll pick a more specific answer, with Johnny and Gyro's fight against the 11 men while under the effects of Sugar Mountain. First, the scenes of Johnny and Gyro having to spend all the money are very entertaining. Then, when you get to the conflict itself, I think it's a very underrated fight with a very clever outcome, which is rendered beautifully in Araki's original artwork. The aftermath with Johnny and Gyro out in the snow is one of my all-time favorite moments in the series. And for Part 8, I think the Vitamin C arc, which includes the flashback, is my favorite. Unlike the others, I was actually reading these chapters as they originally released, and the amount of questions from early JoJolian that it answered was extremely satisfying, as well as introducing some of the most likable characters in the part, easily one of the story's best villains, and ultimately pushing Josuke towards his new goal after discovering his identity. As a bonus, I'll include the spin-off The Spokushibe Rohan as well. My favorite of its chapters is Poaching Seashore, the story featuring Tonio. It has yet to be adapted in the OVAs, so I'm looking forward to maybe seeing it one day. This video's question comes from Christian. He asks, what is my favorite panel from each part from an artistic standpoint? For this one, I'm gonna have to avoid Araki's colored illustrations since that would obviously overshadow the manga itself. For Part 1, I would have to choose the page depicting the death of Jonathan. It's great and has a really old school feeling. For Part 2, I really enjoy this page of Joseph holding up Lisa Lisa. First because it's a good showcase of Araki's art style at that time, and because it plays with perspective in a nice way. For Part 3, it has to be this double spread from Dio's introduction. It has a great amount of detail and is also a great payoff for the huge hyping up that Dio got throughout that story. For Part 4, it's this page from the Highway Star fight, where Josuke destroys the bike to avoid hitting the baby. Like the previous panels, great perspective and detail and reading it naturally in the story makes it really stand out from the hectic chase going on. For Part 5, it's this panel from the end of the fight with White Album. For Part 6, my favorite is the spread of Jolene turning around to face Pucci. Mid to late part 7 contains my favorite art style of Araki's, so it's really impossible to choose just one. So I'll stick with one from my personal favorite fight, this spread of the gun from the battle with the 11 men. In part 8, I really love this page with the first appearance of Speed King. As someone who was reading at the time when this first appeared, it was really effective. And for the spin-off, Thus Spoke Shibe Rohan, I choose this page of Yoma running backwards on the treadmill. Seth asks, with Japan making good stage adaptations like Fist of the North Star, Bleach, My Hero Academia, Naruto, and Demon Slayer, do you think Japan might make a JoJo stage adaptation, and if so, how will it differ from the source? I would definitely be interested in seeing a stage show for JoJo. Honestly, you'd be hard-pressed to find a Japanese media property out there that hasn't had one of these things, so I do think it's surprising that a series as big as JoJo has never had one. I do feel like if we were going to get one, however, we would have gotten it already, since the most popular parts have already been adapted. As for how it would differ from the source material, that may or may not be that big of a question. From what I've seen, a lot of these stage shows can use completely original stories, and full JoJo stories may be a bit too lengthy to fit into a play. Just as an example though, I've gotten into Hunter x Hunter recently, and I've developed a great fondness for its musical stage shows. So I do hope that if there is one for JoJo, that it's a musical. Having character songs was one of my favorite things about the old JoJo the Anthology songs releases, and one of them became the intro to all of my videos. So having more of those would be a blessing. What some people might know is that while JoJo has never gotten a play, another Araki work has. In 2015, there was a stage play adaptation of Under Execution Under Jailbreak. The plot combined that story with another Araki one-shot, Dolce and His Master. The main character was played by Mirai Moriyama, who later went on to play Jugo Shishi in the Thus Spoke Shibe Rohan TV drama. But anyway, I would absolutely love to see a JoJo stage play, and if one were to ever happen, I would aim to cover it on my channel. Belts asks, what are my thoughts on how Araki draws Jonathan and Joseph post Stone Ocean? Well, I do have to correct you here, since the first instance of what you're probably talking about comes from around the time of Part 4, where Joseph and Jonathan can be hard to tell apart. Now personally, I'm completely fine with this. A lot of people have a certain assumption about how Joseph or Jonathan should look by default, most likely because of the anime. Araki, however, does not have this same philosophy. If you go back to the early manga, you can see Jonathan with a headband plenty of times. Some people gripe about it being like Caesar's headband, which would be more fitting for Joseph. However, that repeating triangle pattern is not exclusive to Caesar and can be found on many different characters. It can even be seen on Jonathan himself, before the character of Caesar had even come into existence. And while it may at times be hard to determine that it's Jonathan from first glance, that would be true regardless of his outfit due to the drastic art style shift over the decades. And honestly, this shouldn't cause any confusion when comparing him to Joseph, since the pilot hat makes it unmistakable that it's him. This video's question comes from Ola Sham. What do you think is the best way to view JoJo, the original manga or the anime by David Production? While I do think the anime is great in a lot of ways, I do still believe that the manga is the best possible way to experience JoJo. Something that's true for most adaptations is that while they thrive in some areas, that causes them to fall short in others, often in some disappointing ways. For the manga, however, this isn't an issue. It's just a completely uncompromised version of itself that matches up perfectly with Araki's creative vision. So I would say read the manga first and then experience the anime as a bonus. This video's question comes from Sponge Cake. He asks, what are my favorite music references in the series? Well, of course, as everyone knows, JoJo is absolutely full of music references. Because of my proximity to the series and how often I've looked into all the references, JoJo has actually had a profound effect on my music taste. So if I had to pick out just a few favorites, it would be King Crimson, Killer Queen, and Love Deluxe. This video's question comes from 17 Hit Combo. He asks, before Part 9 comes out, what am I most excited to see in the JoJo lands? What I'll say is that the things I'm looking forward to seeing are not anything that I could possibly answer with. My biggest joy when it came to reading JoJolion Monthly was that it was impossible to predict what would happen next. So while I am excited to see callbacks to Parts 7 and 8 in the story, even more than that, I'm looking forward to being surprised by all the new things we'll be seeing. This video's question comes from Kaori. They ask, what pushed me to make this channel? Well, I first started making JoJo videos all the way back in summer of 2015, immediately after the end of the Stardust Crusaders anime. I would say that was my peak of excitement for JoJo, experiencing the manga for the first time, while also having the possibility of seeing it all adapted in the future. JoJo is my favorite series across any media, so I think I just felt I needed to be a part of it in some way. Thankfully, it's become a very fun and rewarding thing for me to do, and it gives me a great opportunity to help other people understand the series, while also expanding my own knowledge of it in the process. This video's question comes from Freddy. He asks, where did I first hear about JoJo and what is the first thing that stood out to me? My very first exposure to JoJo was a video by Super Best Friends Play where Pat and Wooly played All-Star Battle back when it first came out. I was very interested in the generational aspect of it, where each protagonist is related and even the son of the original villain appears. The other thing that interested me was how different characters had unique powers, like the difference between Hamon and Stans. Sometime later I watched the 2012 anime, which was the only season of the current adaptation at the time, which got me into the series. This video's patron question comes from Seth. He asks which JoJo light novel I would like to see animated by David Production. Now, I actually haven't read all of the light novels yet, but I would say that I'd like to see Purple Haze Feedback animated the most. I really enjoy its new characters, and I think some of the fights would be really amazing to see in motion. It's also written by Kohei Kodono, who is writing Crazy Diamond's Demonic Heartbreak, another spin-off that I really enjoy. So that novel would definitely be my first pick. This video's question comes from 17 Hit Combo. He asks throughout the series, what is my favorite set of stands and characters? I assume by this they mean which parts have my favorite. I would say that when it comes to characters, Part 7 is the best for having some of my all-time favorites like Johnny, Gyro, Diego, and Lucy Steele. When it comes to stands, I think Part 5 is the strongest, having a lot of them with pretty good variety. What I like most of Part 5 character stands though is how much they're able to work together in interesting ways. This video's question comes from Lime Jinjo. They ask, what other series do I like? Strictly talking about anime and manga here, my other favorites are Cowboy Bebop, One Piece, Hunter x Hunter, and Monster. This video's question comes from Pulse Dog. He asks, why haven't I made One Piece videos yet when I discussed doing so before? I'd say the main reason is that I don't feel like I'm really an expert when it comes to One Piece. For JoJo, I've been a fan of the series for nearly 10 years now, and had already accumulated a lot of knowledge of the series before I even started making videos. So I feel like just over time, I know enough about JoJo to be able to remember small details I need for videos. For One Piece, I only got into it around the end of 2021, so I feel like I'm not really at the level where I can make videos about it without kind of just copying what everyone else says about it. At some point though, I do want to make some kind of videos about it since it's become one of my favorite series. When that is though, I have no idea. This video's question comes from Rex. He asks, which of the light novels, side manga, or art books do I think Viz Media will localize in the future? Well, so far we just have the Spokeshibe Rohan and the JoJo 6251 book. I don't particularly have much faith in Viz when it comes to this since we didn't get the Rohan Gucci chapter in that release and 6251 was delayed for months before it finally came out. And while this release did fix some of the errors in the original book, it still included some of its own. Of course, I would like to see JoJo Agogo and most of all JoJo Veller get official releases. But those two are more specialty items compared to 6251, and JoJo Veller in particular has a lot of text to translate. As for side manga, I think the next most important thing would be Dead Man's Questions, one of Araki's best side stories and the only one left connected to JoJo. It would also be nice to see releases of Araki's older manga like we've seen in other countries. This video's question comes from Sponge Cake. He asks, what is my favorite JoJo volume cover and my favorite art piece Araki has done? I'd say my favorite would be volume 45, which covers the Bites the Dust arc. It's very unique and it's one of my favorite kinds of covers, which are the ones that don't feature the protagonist. As for an art piece, that's really hard, but I'll have to go with the chapter cover for Dead Man's Questions. Since Kira, and especially this iteration, is one of my favorite characters, and I really like all the different flashes of things from the story being printed on his clothes. This video's question comes from Rex. He asks, what are my thoughts on what Viz Media has done with JoJo as a whole? Well, overall, I'm okay with it. I'll try to keep this brief since I actually want to make a video on this topic in the future. First of all, I get to own almost the entire manga in hardcover form, which is better than what I can say for most series. I do, however, have issue with a lot of the content of the books. When it comes to the original JoJonium re-releases, I like them well enough. I like Araki's modern illustrations for the covers, although I do wish there was a way to have the classic covers that I think best represent those stories. My main issue, however, comes with the release starting with Part 4. I take huge issue with the way they approach the chapter titles. In most good scanlations of a manga, people will remake the Japanese text and, where necessary, edit the artwork to make it appear seamlessly. This can be seen in a lot of the official non-English releases of JoJo. Our releases instead choose to plaster a giant black box on top of the art to show the title. These just look really bad and I don't think it works at all. That's all I'll say for now, since I have some more I could get into at a later date. This video's question comes from Blitzwolf. They ask, what is something I think the JoJo anime did better than the manga? Well, good timing, since I actually think the 2012 anime that adapted parts 1 and 2 were better. These were my first ever exposure to JoJo back when the anime hadn't gotten to part 3. I think they're well paced, have a great cast, have music that I think stands above the rest of the adaptation's OSTs, and had a very good balance between having a unique art style but still one that didn't stray too far from the original. Overall, I think the 2012 anime was the one that did the most to improve the experience, and while I love all of the anime's seasons, each one did have their specific flaws that held them back from overtaking the source material. This video's question comes from X-Station O. They ask what other series I would like to cover besides JoJo. Well, I have mentioned in the past that I'd like to cover One Piece at some point. It's one of my favorite manga, but it's hard to choose what to talk about when there's already so many others covering it. And as a newer fan of it than I am for JoJo, I really don't have a large knowledge base when it comes to One Piece. Something else I'd like to cover is Kamen Rider, which I'm a big fan of. However, it is pretty niche, and I'd have to think of the right kind of video to make about it. Both of those are also Toei properties, and I'm pretty sure they're more strict when it comes to copyright. I could also delve into some of the other series I enjoy, like the Yakuza or Like a Dragon games, or the Metal Gear Solid series. But again, there's a lot to cover, and I wouldn't be sure how to approach them since they are a different medium. If you have any other ideas that you think might be good to cover, I'd ask that you go ahead and comment them for consideration. This video's question comes from Blitzwolf. They ask, do I have a favorite author's note by Araki? Well, as you all surely know, Araki has had a long and hilarious series of author's notes. I actually want to make a video in the future going over all the best ones. While I'm not sure on what my favorite would be, this time I'll just pick one I really like. This comes from Steel Ball Run, Volume 10. It's something that was given to me, but I have a swimsuit calendar hanging on the wall of my workplace. In other words, I have 12 pictures of girls in bathing suits in my office. Nothing too naughty. Every time the month changes, I have to flip the page to the next girl, and that somehow makes me feel incredibly melancholy. I feel like I'm saying, goodbye September girl, I'll never see you again. And when I flip the page, I end up betraying her already and thinking October's not bad either. What I'm trying to say is that a year goes by really quickly. This video's question comes from Rex. They ask, did the music reference series inspire my taste in music? I would say definitely yes. When I first made my original series on the references, a lot of the songs I had never heard before. Since then, practically my entire personal playlist could be traced back to something I originally got into because of JoJo. And I regularly keep expanding my taste thanks to the references that continue to be added in recent years. This video's question comes from 17-Hit Combo. They ask, what is my favorite Araki interview? Well, I'd say it would be the Part 5 afterword that I featured in this video. I think it's the best possible example of JoJo's theme put into words, and Araki talks about the character's relationships with fate in great detail. Here he also gets into his decision to not have Fugo betray the group as initially planned, and instead to have him leave. Due to his depression at the time, he didn't want to have to portray something that negative. It's understandable that Araki would have a negative mindset during Part 5, which as he says is a story that deals with a lot of pain. But I think that this is also a good example of how Araki's own mindset shapes the story. Araki says that he was inspired by the characters, and by trying to look positively to the future in real life, the story reflects this as well and leaves Fugo's future ambiguous instead of needing him to die to resolve his arc. That's all the questions for now, but if you want to submit one to be read at the end of a video, or in a future compilation, you can support the Patreon at any tier and submit them via my page's Member Posts tab. I like doing these, so if you're a patron, go ahead and submit as many as you like. Thank you for watching. This is the part of the video where I thank my $5 and up patrons. Thank you to Alex Ramirez, Doorbell, Crayon, Rigovids, Zucato, Pumpkin Doge, Marrow, Almighty Quarth, Cowrie, Gatlin Grove, Lime Jinjo, 17 Hit Combo, Sponge Cake, Cakext, Feliciano Rabaja, Rayana Meme, Christian McDonough, Navi, Emmanuel Etienne, Pulse Dog, Great Riek, D, Dr. Zombie, Carmo Trina, Hunter Gill, Adam Grogan, and Zach G.